Long, you can find it on page 36 of the front part of your Red Pew Bible, Genesis chapter 39. I'll be reading verses 1 to 23. And again, it picks up sort of halfway in the story of the life of Joseph. Now, Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended to him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And blessings of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was a handsome and good-looking man. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me, and he fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the very same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us, came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," well, he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all of the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Gracious God, give us ears to hear, eyes to see, and hearts that are open to receive and respond to your message to us this day. Amen. I have a few memories of junior high school. Most of them were very good memories, but I have one very bad memory. It was in home economics class. Do you remember home economics class? I'm not sure they still teach that anymore, but I really liked it. I learned to sew, and I learned to bake, and other things which I have forgotten to do all those many years later. But I had one teacher, her name was Mrs. Hall. Now, my recollection, when I remember her, she was about 118 years old. She was probably a lot less old than that, but I was young, she was old, and she was hard of seeing and hard of hearing. Now, I was a middle school boy. I know we have some middle school boys here, and let's just say back then I wasn't the most kind or caring or compassionate to Mrs. Hall. But I wasn't the worst in my class, okay? To be fair, I had another friend whose name I will not mention, who was quite rude to her from time to time and had a way of speaking loud enough for her to hear, but she could never quite trace where the noise came from. And she was always, when she would give us a project to do, she would kind of sit down in her chair, sometimes fall asleep and take a nap. You know, she was 118 after all. And my friend would whisper or would say something and sort of throw his voice to a corner of the room. And she would look up and say, what was that? What was that? And she would be looking to see if someone, had a question or if someone raised a hand. And he would move throughout the room and raise hands at different places of the room. I mean, it was funny at the time, but not so funny. But one day, he was being had his antics, and she looked up at the moment I was about to say something to one of my friends and thought that I was the culprit, and looked directly at me and thought that I was behind the whole thing, and she caught me. So she sent me to the principal's office. For the first time, and the only time, I was sent to the principal's office, and for something I actually didn't do. Now, I wasn't perfect, all right? I don't get me wrong, but I didn't do that, at least at that moment. I was being caught and punished for something that I didn't do. Falsely accused and unjustly punished. I had to go to the principal's office. And worse, my parents got a phone call too. And I had to have a talking to, of course. But I will say from that time on, I was much kinder to her, and she retired after that year. So we were her worst class, I'm sure, and we led to her retirement, which I'm sad to say. But I wish her life all well. So that's a little situation for me. This situation we read in the case of Joseph was very, very different. His situation in life was much more dire than mine, and he found himself in yet another unfair circumstance that seemed quite hopeless at the time. Now, if you recall the story of Joseph from earlier, it started very well for him. He was the youngest among many, many of his brothers, and he was the favorite son to his dad. In fact, his dad gave him this amazing Technicolor dream coat, right? You know that? Yes, that's Joseph. That's the Joseph. But his brothers were jealous of him, right, as you would think, did not want him to be around, so they had a trap for him. They plotted to kill him. Then they said, well, let's not kill him. Let's get some money for him instead. So they sold him into slavery to Egyptians, and he gets led all the way from his homeland in Canaan to a brand new foreign land in Egypt. This is the story of young Joseph. It's not fair, and it's not going very well for him. He's excommunicated by his brothers. His father thinks that he is dead, and he's in this foreign land. But yet, he trusted that God was still with him, even in that situation. He was sold into slavery and became really a slave, and we read to a person named Potiphar. He was Potiphar's servant. But we read that the Lord was with Joseph during that situation so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And then it said the blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field, because of Joseph. Joseph was blessed by God, as we talked about last week. Abraham received that blessing so that he could be a blessing to others. And here we have Joseph believing the same thing, even in really difficult, tough situations, still believing and trusting that God was with him and God was for him. And because of that, God ended up blessing all of those who were around him. Everything that he put his hand to was blessed because of that relationship, because of that trust. But then things went horribly wrong again for Joseph. Lies were told about him, as we read. That was the saucy part, and it led to his imprisonment. So false accusations and imprisonment. It's a really wild story. But what's interesting is that stories like that continue to happen all the time, and especially in our society. This issue is a contemporary one for many in our country. Often poor and of minority status, individuals falsely accused, incarcerated, and sentenced to death. Now, Joseph had no one to turn to or to trust except for God. Thankfully, there are many in our country who turn to Brian Stevenson, an American lawyer, social justice activist, law professor of NYU School of Law, and the founder of Equal Justice Initiative. His book, which is turned into a movie called Just Mercy, which maybe some of you have read or you've seen that movie, tells the remarkable story of this young Harvard Law School graduate early in the days when he started this small nonprofit law office in Montgomery, Alabama, dedicated to defending the poor, defending the rights of the incarcerated and the wrongly condemned. The book is powerful, and I highly commend this book to you. And the movie was quite good as well. It starred Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan. And in the movie, it focused on the case of Walter McMillan, who was convicted and sentenced for death for a crime that he did not commit. It's a remarkable organization and a great ministry, and I do recommend learning more about that. And we give thanks to God for lawyers like Brian and others in our country who are doing that really hard work. Now, perhaps you're involved in work like that. Perhaps that is not your calling. Maybe you have been a victim of false accusations or a victim of a lie. Or simply, you've been placed in a position or a situation or a place that you did not want to be in at some point in your life, or even right now. And you struggle to see how God is in this situation. Let me ask, have you ever been in a situation where you wondered if God was there? I'm sure Joseph did many times throughout his life. Thought, God, where are you in this pit that my brothers have thrown you in? Where are you when I'm on this caravan, now a slave going to Egypt? God, where are you? I'm now a servant and a slave in this new land. God, now I'm in prison for something I didn't do. What gives? Where are you? Are you here with me? Are you my help and my refuge in times of trouble? My guess is at some point in our lives, we've all been there. Something has happened to us or in us that has caused us to question where God is. And can any good come from this situation? And maybe even more importantly, are we going to be all right? In this situation, can we ever find peace and comfort? You know, it's one thing to feel God's presence and to feel God's blessings when you're on the mountaintop, right? When you're the favorite son with the sweet jacket. When you're in good health and the stock market is soaring. When you're at the summit of your experiences, your hopes and your dreams are being fulfilled. It's certainly easy to feel God's blessings and to know that God is with us in those situations. But what about when we are at our lowest? Maybe professionally or personally or spiritually. What about when you're in the doghouse? Maybe with your colleague or your children or your spouse. What about when we are in the valleys and the ditches and the prisons and the principal's offices? What about then, during those times in our life? Well, we turn back to Joseph. And we come back to this text that said, but while Joseph was there in prison, and this part is powerful for me, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Even in the prisons of our lives, which sometimes are our own doing and our own making, sometimes they're not, we can trust that God is still with us. God's hand blessing us, protecting us, guiding us, delivering us. You see, life can be predictable, unpredictable. It can change from from week to week, from Sunday to Sunday, from day to day. It's full of joys and sorrows, beautiful blessings and distressing difficulties. They can all come unexpectedly, kind of like weather in Vermont. It can change in an instant. And this is just the reality that we live with. We know this to be true. So how can we find peace amidst such turbulence? By trusting that God is with us always. And God is our ever-present help in times of trouble. Horatio Spafford knew something about life's unexpected challenges. He was a successful attorney and a real estate investor who lost a fortune in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Around the same time, his beloved 4-year-old son died of scarlet fever. Thinking a vacation would do his family some good, he sent his wife and 4 daughters on a ship to England, planning to join them after he finished some pressing business at home. However, while crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the ship was involved in a terrible collision and sunk. More than 200 people lost their lives, including all 4 of Horatio Spafford's daughters. His wife, Anna, survived the tragedy. Upon arriving in England, she sent a telegram to her husband that began with these words, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" Horatio immediately set sail for England. And at one point during his voyage, the captain of the ship, aware of the tragedy that had struck the Spafford family, summoned Horatio to tell him that they were now passing over the spot where the shipwreck had occurred. As Horatio thought about his daughters and thought about God's promises and God's presence in his life, words of comfort and hope filled his heart and his mind. He wrote them down, and they have since become a well-beloved hymn. And he wrote these words when he was over that spot on the Atlantic Ocean. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to know. It is well with my soul." So friends, I know it's challenging. Perhaps we cannot always say that in everything, that it is well in all aspects of our lives. There will be storms to face, and sometimes there will be tragedies, and sometimes we'll find ourselves in various prisons and in situations and circumstances that we didn't plan to be and we did not want to be in. But with faith in a loving God and with trust in his divine help, my prayer for all of us is that we can confidently say, it is well with my soul. God is with us. God is our help, our refuge, now and always. Amen.